Chapter 17b of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick McAfee. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 17b. In Finley's Reports on the Character of 600 Tornadoes, very suggestive bits of description occur. Cloud bounded along the earth like a ball. Or that it was no meteorological phenomenon, but something very much like a huge, solid ball that was bounding along, crushing and carrying with it everything within its field. Cloud bounded along, coming to the earth every 800 or 1,000 yards. Here's an interesting bit that I got somewhere else. I offer it as a datum in superbiology, which, however, is a branch of advanced science that I'll not take up, restricting to things indefinitely called objects. The tornado came wriggling, jumping, whirling like a great green snake, darting out a score of glistening fangs. Though it's interesting, I think that's sensational myself. It may be that vast green snakes sometimes rush past this earth, taking a swift bite wherever they can. But as I say, that's a superbiologic phenomenon. Finley gives dozens of instances of tornado clouds that seem to be more like solid things, swathed in clouds, than clouds. He notes that in the tornado at Americus, Georgia, July 18, 1881, a strange sulphurous vapor was emitted from the cloud. In many instances, objects or meteoritic stones that have come from this earth's externality have had a sulphurous odor. Why a wind effect should be sulphurous is not clear. That a vast object from external regions should be sulphurous is in line with many data. This phenomenon is described in the Monthly Weather Review, July 1881, as a strange sulphurous vapor, burning and sickening all who approached close enough to breathe it. The conventional explanation of tornadoes as wind effects, which we do not deny in some instances, is so strong in the United States that it is better to look elsewhere for an account of an object that has hurtled through this Earth's atmosphere, rising and falling and defying this Earth's gravitation. Nature, 7/112. That, according to a correspondent to the Birmingham Morning News, the people living near King's Sutton, Banbury, saw, about 1 o'clock, December 7, 1872, something like a haycock hurtling through the air. Like a meteor, it was accompanied by fire and a dense smoke, and made a noise like that of a railway train. It was sometimes high in the air and sometimes near the ground. The effect was tornado-like. Trees and walls were knocked down. It's a late day now to try to verify this story, but a list is given of persons whose property was injured. We are told that this thing then disappeared all at once. These are the smaller objects, which may be derailed railway trains or big green snakes, for all I know, but our expression upon approach to this earth by vast dark bodies, that likely they'd be made luminous, would envelop in clouds, perhaps, or would have their own clouds, but that they'd quake, and that they'd affect this earth with quakes, and that then would occur a fall of matter from such a world, or rise of matter from this earth to a nearby world, or both fall and rise, or exchange of matter, process known to advanced seismology as celestiometathesis. Except that, if matter from some other world, and it would be like someone to get it into his head that we absolutely deny gravitation, just because we cannot accept orthodox dogmas, except that, if matter from another world, filling the sky of this earth generally, as to a hemisphere, or locally, should be attracted to this earth, it would seem thinkable that the whole thing should drop here, and not merely its surface materials. Objects upon a ship's bottom. From time to time they drop to the bottom of the ocean. The ship does not. Or, like our acceptance, upon dripping from aerial ice fields, we think of only a part of a nearby world succumbing, except in being caught in suspension to this earth's gravitation, and surface materials falling from that part. Explain or express or accept, and what does it matter? Our attitude is, here are the data. See for yourself. What does it matter what my notions may be? Here are the data. But think for yourself, or think for myself. All mixed up we must be. A long time must go by before we can know Florida from Long Island. So we've had data of fishes that have fallen from our now established and respectabilized Super Sargasso Sea, which we've almost forgotten. It's now so respectable. But we shall have data of fishes that have fallen during earthquakes. These, we accept, were dragged down from ponds or other worlds that have been quaked when only a few miles away by this earth, some other world also quaking this earth. In a way, or in its principle, our subject is orthodox enough. Only grant proximity of other worlds, which, however, will not be a matter of granting, but will be a matter of data. And one conventionally conceives of their surfaces quaked, even of a whole lake full of fishes being quaked and dragged down from one of them. The lake full of fishes may cause a little pain to some minds, but the fall of sand and stones is pleasantly enough thought of. More scientific persons, or more faithful hypnotics than we, have taken up this subject unpainfully, relatively to the moon. For instance, Perry has gone over 15,000 records of earthquakes, and he has correlated many with proximities of the moon, or has attributed many to the pull of the moon when nearest to this earth. Also, there is a paper upon this subject in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Cornwall, 1845. Or, theoretically, when at its closest to this earth, the moon quakes the face of this earth, and is itself quaked, but does not itself fall to this earth. As to showers of matter that may have come from the moon at such times, one can go over old records and find what one pleases. That is what we now shall do. Our expressions are for acceptance only. Our data. We take them from 4 classes of phenomena that have preceded or accompanied earthquakes: unusual clouds, darkness profound, luminous appearances in the sky, and falls of substances and objects, whether commonly called meteoric or not. Not one of these occurrences fits in with principles of primitive or primary seismology, and every one of them is a datum of a quaked body passing close to this earth or suspended over it. To the primitives, there is not a reason in the world why a convulsion of this earth's surface should be accompanied by unusual sights in the sky, by darkness, or by the fall of substances or objects from the sky. As to phenomena like these, or storms preceding earthquakes, the irreconcilability is still greater. It was before 1860 that Perry made his great compilation. We take most of our data from lists compiled long ago. Only the safe and unpainful have been published in recent years, at least in ambitious, voluminous form. The restraining hand of the system, as we call it, whether it has any real existence or not, is tight upon the sciences of today. The uncanniest aspect of our quasi-existence that I know of is that everything that seems to have one identity has also as high a seeming of everything else. In this oneness of allness, or continuity, the protecting hand strangles, the parental stifles. Love is inseparable from phenomena of hate. There is only continuity, that is, in quasi-existence. Nature, at least in its correspondence columns, still evades this protective strangulation, and the Monthly Weather Review is still a rich field of unfaithful observation. But in looking over other long-established periodicals, I have noted their glimmers of quasi-individuality fade gradually, after about 1860, and the surrender of their attempted identities to a higher attempted organization. Some of them expressing intermediateness-wide endeavor to localize the universal, or to localize self, soul, identity, entity, or positiveness, or realness, held out until as far as 1880, traces findable up to 1890, and then expressing the universal process, except that here and there in the world's history there may have been successful approximations to positiveness by individuals, who only then became individuals and attained to selves or souls of their own, surrendered, submitted, became parts of a higher organization's attempt to individualize or systematize into a complete thing, or to localize the universal or the attributes of the universal. After the death of Richard Proctor, whose occasional illiberalities I'd not like to emphasize too much, all succeeding volumes of knowledge have yielded scarcely an unconventionality. Note the great number of times that the American Journal of Science and the Report of the British Association are quoted. Note that after, say, 1885, they're scarcely mentioned in these inspired but illicit pages, as by hypnosis and inertia we keep on saying. About 1880. Throttle and disregard. But the coercion could not be positive, and many of the excommunicated continued to creep in, or, even to this day, some of the strangled are faintly breathing. Some of our data have been hard to find. We could tell stories of great labor and fruitless quests that would, though perhaps imperceptibly, stir the sympathy of a Mr. Symons. But in this matter of concurrence of earthquakes with aerial phenomena, which are as unassociable with earthquakes, if internally caused, as falls of sand on convulsed small boys full of sour apples, the abundance of so-called evidence is so great that we can only sketchily go over the data, beginning with Robert Mallett's catalogue, Report of the British Association, 1852, omitting some extraordinary instances because they occurred before the 18th century. Earthquake preceded by a violent tempest. England, January 8th, 1704. Preceded by a brilliant meteor. Switzerland, November 4th, 1704. Luminous cloud moving at high velocity, disappearing behind the horizon. Florence, December 9th, 1731. Thick mists in the air, through which a dim light was seen. Several weeks before the shock, globes of light had been seen in the air. Swabia, May 22nd, 1732. Reign of Earth, Carpentras, France, October 18th, 1737. A Black Cloud, London, March 19th, 1750. Violent storm and a strange star of octagonal shape, Slavange, Norway, April 15th, 1752. Balls of fire from a streak in the sky, Augermanland, 1752. Numerous meteorites, Lisbon, October 15th, 1755. Terrible tempests, over and over, falls of hail and brilliant meteors, instance after instance, an immense globe, Switzerland, November 2nd, 1761. Oblong sulphurous cloud, Germany, April 1767. Extraordinary mass of vapor, Boulogne, April 1780. Heavens obscured by a dark mist, Grenada, August 7, 1804. Strange howling noises in the air, and large spots obscuring the sun, Palermo, Italy, April 16, 1817. Luminous meteor moving in the same direction as the shock, Naples, November 22, 1821. Fireball appearing in the sky, apparent size of the moon, Thuringerwald, November 29, 1831. And, unless you be polarized by the new dominant, which is calling for recognition of multiplicities of external things as a dominant, dawning new over Europe in 1492, called for recognition of terrestrial externality to Europe. Unless you have this contact with the new, you have no affinity for these data. Beans that drop from a magnet, irreconcilables that glide from the mind of a Thomson. Or my own acceptance that we do not really think at all, that we correlate around supermagnets that I call dominants, a spiritual dominant in one age, and responsively to it upspring monasteries, and the stake and the cross are its symbols. A materialist dominant, and upspring laboratories, and microscopes, and telescopes, and crucibles are its icons. That were nothing but iron filings, relatively to a succession of magnets that displace preceding magnets. With no soul of your own, and with no soul of my own, except that some day some of us may no longer be intermediatisms, but may hold out against the cosmos, that once upon a time thousands of fishes were cast from one pail of water. We have psychovalency for these data, if we're obedient slaves to the new dominant, and repulsion to them, if we're mere correlates to the old dominant. I'm a soulless and selfless correlate to the new dominant, myself. I see what I have to see. The only inducement I can hold out in my attempt to rake up disciples is that someday the new will be fashionable. The new correlates will sneer at the old correlates. After all, there is some inducement to that, and I'm not altogether sure it's desirable to end up as a fixed star. As a correlate to the new dominant, I am very much impressed with some of these data. The luminous object that moved in the same direction as an earthquake. It seems very acceptable that a quake followed this thing as it passed near this Earth's surface. The streak that was seen in the sky, or only a streak that was visible of another world. And objects or meteorites that were shaken down from it. the quake at Carpentras, France, and that above Carpentras was a smaller world, more violently quaked, so that Earth was shaken down from it. But I like best the super wolves that were seen to cross the sun during the earthquake at Palermo. They howled, or the loves of the worlds, the call they feel for one another. They try to move closer and howl when they get there. The howls of the planets. I have discovered a new unintelligibility. In the Edinburgh New Philosophical Journal, have to go way back to 1841, days of less efficient strangulation, Sir David Milne lists phenomena of quakes in Great Britain. I pick out a few that indicate to me that other worlds were near this Earth's surface. Violent storm before a shock of 1703. Ball of fire preceding. 1750. A large ball of fire seen upon day following a quake. 1755. Uncommon phenomenon in the air. A large luminous body, bent like a crescent, which stretched itself over the heavens. 1816. Vast ball of fire. 1750. Black rains and black snows. 1755. Numerous instances of upward projection, or upward attraction, during quakes, preceded by a cloud, very black and lowering. 1795. Fall of black powder, preceding a quake by 6 hours. 1837. Some of these instances seem to me to be very striking. A smaller world. It is greatly racked by the attraction of this Earth. Black substance is torn down from it. Not until 6 hours later, after an approach still closer, does this Earth suffer perturbation. As to the extraordinary spectacle of a thing, world, superconstruction, that was seen in the sky in 1816, I have not yet been able to find out more. I think that here our acceptance is relatively sound, that this occurrence was tremendously of more importance than such occurrence as, say, transits of Venus, upon which hundreds of papers have been written. That not another mention have I found, though I have not looked so especially as I shall look for more data, that all but undetailed record of this occurrence was suppressed. Altogether, we have considerable agreement here between data of vast masses that do not fall to this Earth, but from which substances fall, and data of fields of ice, from which ice may not fall off, but from which water may drip. I'm beginning to modify that at a distance from this Earth, gravitation has more effect than we have supposed, though less effect than the dogmatists suppose and prove. I'm coming out stronger for the acceptance of a neutral zone, that this Earth, like other magnets, has a neutral zone, in which is the Super Sargasso Sea, and in which other worlds may be buoyed up, though projecting parts may be subject to this Earth's attraction. But my preference, here are the data. I now have one of the most interesting of the new correlates. I think I should have brought it in before, but whether out of place here, because not accompanied by earthquake or not, we'll have it. I offer it as an instance of an eclipse by a vast dark body that has been seen and reported by an astronomer. The astronomer is M. Lias. The phenomenon was seen by him at Pernambuco, April 11, 1860. Comptes rendus, 50, 1197. It was about noon, sky cloudless. Suddenly the light of the sun was diminished. The darkness increased, and, to illustrate its intensity, we are told that the planet Venus shone brilliant. But Venus was of low visibility at this time. The observation that burns incense to the new dominant is that around the sun appeared a corona. There are many other instances that indicate proximity of other worlds during earthquakes. I note a few: quake and an object in the sky, called a large luminous meteor. Quarterly Journal, Royal Institute, 5/132. Luminous body in the sky, earthquake and fall of sand, Italy, February 12th and 13th, 1870. La Science pour tout, 15/159. Many reports upon luminous object in the sky and earthquake, Connecticut, February 27, 1883. Monthly Weather Review, February 1883. Luminous object or meteor in the sky, fall of stones from the sky, and earthquake, Italy, January 20, 1891. L'Astronomie, 1891, 154. Earthquake and prodigious number of luminous bodies or globes in the air, Boulogne, France, June 7th, 1779. Sestier, La Foudre, 1/169. Earthquake at Manila, 1863, and curious luminous appearance in the sky, Ponton, Earthquakes, page 124. The most notable appearance of fishes during an earthquake is that of Riobamba. Humboldt sketched one of them, and it's an uncanny looking thing. Thousands of them appeared on the ground during this tremendous earthquake. Humboldt says that they were cast up from subterranean sources. I think not myself, and have data for thinking not. But there'd be such a row, arguing back and forth, that it's simpler to consider a clearer instance of the fall of living fishes from the sky during an earthquake. I can't quite accept, myself, whether a large lake and all the fishes in it was torn down from some other world, or a lake in the Super Sargasso Sea, distracted between two pulling worlds, was dragged down to this earth. Here are the data. La Science pour tout, 6/191. February 16th, 1861. An earthquake at Singapore. Then came an extraordinary downpour of rain, or as much water as any good-sized lake would consist of. For 3 days this rain, or this fall of water, came down in torrents. In pools on the ground, formed by this deluge, great numbers of fishes were found. The writer says that he had himself seen nothing but water fall from the sky. Whether I'm emphasizing what a deluge it was or not, he says that so terrific had been the downpour that he had not been able to see 3 steps away from him. The natives said that the fishes had fallen from the sky. 3 days later the pools dried up and many dead fishes were found. But in the first place, though that's an expression for which we have an instinctive dislike, the fishes had been active and uninjured. Then follows material for another of our little studies in the phenomena of disregard. A psychotropism here is mechanically to take pen in hand and mechanically write that fishes found on the ground after a heavy rainfall came from overflowing streams. The writer of the account says that some of the fishes had been found in his courtyard, which was surrounded by high walls. Paying no attention to this, a correspondent, La Science pour tout, 6/317, explains that in the heavy rain a body of water had probably overflowed, carrying fishes with it. We are told by the first writer that these fishes of Singapore were of a species that was very abundant near Singapore. So I think myself that a whole lake full of them had been shaken down from the Super Sargasso Sea under the circumstances we have thought of. However, if appearance of strange fishes after an earthquake be more pleasing in the sight, or to the nostrils of the new dominant, we faithfully and piously supply that incense. An account of the occurrence at Singapore was read by M. de Castelnau before the French Academy. M. de Castelnau recalled that, upon a former occasion, he had submitted to the Academy the circumstance that fishes of a new species had appeared at the Cape of Good Hope after an earthquake. It seems proper, and it will give luster to the new orthodoxy, now to have an instance in which not merely quake and fall of rocks or meteorites, or quake and either eclipse or luminous appearances in the sky have occurred, but in which are combined all the phenomena, one or more of which, when accompanying earthquake, indicate, in our acceptance, the proximity of another world. This time a longer duration is indicated than in other instances. In the Canadian Institute Proceedings 2-7-198, there is an account by the Deputy Commissioner at Dhurmsala of the extraordinary Dhurmsala meteorite, coated with ice. But the combination of events related by him is still more extraordinary. That within a few months of the fall of this meteorite, there had been a fall of live fishes at Benares, a shower of red substance at Farrukh Abad, a dark spot observed on the disk of the sun, an earthquake, an unnatural darkness of some duration, and a luminous appearance in the sky that looked like an aurora borealis. But there's more to this climax. We are introduced to a new order of phenomena: visitors. The Deputy Commissioner writes that, in the evening after the fall of the Dhurmsala meteorite, or mass of stone covered with ice, he saw lights. Some of them were not very high. They appeared and went out and reappeared. I have read many accounts of the Dhurmsala meteorite, July 28, 1860, but never in any other of them a mention of this new correlate. Something as out of place in the 19th century as would have been an aeroplane, the invention of which would not, in our acceptance, have been permitted in the 19th century, though adumbrations to it were permitted. This writer says that the lights moved like fire balloons, but I am sure that they were neither fire balloons, lanterns, nor bonfires, or any other thing of that sort, but bona fide lights in the heavens. It's a subject for which we shall have to have a separate expression. Trespassers upon territory to which something else has a legal right. Perhaps someone lost a rock, and he and his friends came down looking for it in the evening, or secret agents or emissaries who had an appointment with certain esoteric ones near Dhurmsala, things or beings coming down to explore and unable to stay down long. In a way, another strange occurrence during an earthquake is suggested. The ancient Chinese tradition, the marks like hoof marks in the ground. We have thought, with a low degree of acceptance, of another world that may be in secret communication with certain esoteric ones of this earth's inhabitants, and of messages in symbols like hoof marks that are sent to some receptor or special hill upon this earth, and of messages that at times miscarry. This other world comes close to this world. There are quakes, but advantage of proximity is taken to send a message. The message designed for a receptor in India, perhaps, or in Central Europe, miscarries all the way to England. Marks like the marks of the Chinese tradition are found upon a beach in Cornwall after an earthquake. Philosophical Transactions, 500. After the quake of July 15, 1757, upon the sands of Penzance, Cornwall, in an area of more than 100 square yards, were found marks like hoof prints, except that they were not crescentic. We feel a similarity, but note an arbitrary disregard of our own. This time, it seems to us that marks described as little cones surrounded by basins of equal diameter would be like hoof prints, if hoofs printed complete circles. Other disregards are that there were black specks on the tops of cones, as if something, perhaps gaseous, had issued from them, that from one of these formations came a gush of water as thick as a man's wrist. Of course, the opening of springs is common in earthquakes, but we suspect, myself, that the negative absolute is compelling us to put in this datum and its disorders. There's another matter in which the negative absolute seems to work against us, though to superchemistry we have introduced the principle of celestio metathesis. We have no good data of exchange of substances during proximities. The data are all of falls, and not of upward translations. Of course, upward impulses are common during earthquakes, but I haven't a datum upon a tree or a fish or a brick or a man that ever did go up and stay up, and that never did come down again. Our classic of the horse and barn occurred in what was called a whirlwind. It is said that, in an earthquake in Calabria, paving stones shot up far in the air. The writer doesn't specifically say that they came down again, but something seems to tell me they did. The corpses of Riobamba. Humboldt reported that in the quake of Riobamba, bodies were torn upward from graves, that the vertical motion was so strong that bodies were tossed several hundred feet in the air. I explain that if, in the center of greatest violence of an earthquake, anything ever has gone up, and has kept on going up, the thoughts of the nearest observers were very likely upon other subjects. The Key of Lisbon. We are told that it went down. A vast throng of persons ran to the quay for refuge. The city of Lisbon was in profound darkness. The quay and all the people on it disappeared. If it and they went down, not a single corpse, not a shred of clothing, not a plank of the quay, nor so much as a splinter of it, ever floated to the surface. End of chapter 17. Recording by Patrick McAfee, Chicago, gis.depaul.edu/pmcAfee.
18 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 18. The New Dominant. I mean, primarily, all that opposes exclusionism. That development, or progress, or evolution, is attempt to positivize, and is a mechanism by which a positive existence is recruited. That what we call existence is a womb of infinitude, and is itself only incubatory. That eventually all attempts are broken down by the falsely excluded. Subjectively, the breaking down is aided by our own sense of false and narrow limitations. So the classic and academic artists wrought positivist paintings, and expressed the only ideal that I am conscious of, though we so often hear of ideals instead of different manifestations, artistically, scientifically, theologically, politically, of the one ideal. They sought to satisfy, in its artistic aspect, cosmic craving for unity or completeness, sometimes called harmony, called beauty in some aspects. By disregard they sought completeness. But the light effects that they disregarded and their narrow confinement to standardized subjects brought on the revolt of the Impressionists. So the Puritans tried to systematize, and they disregarded physical needs, or vices, or relaxations. They were invaded and overthrown when their narrowness became obvious and intolerable. All things strive for positiveness for themselves, or for quasi-systems of which they are parts. Formality and the mathematic, the regular and the uniform are aspects of the positive state. But the positive is the universal, so all attempted positiveness that seems to satisfy in the aspects of formality and regularity, sooner or later disqualifies in the aspect of wideness or universalness. So there is revolt against the science of today because the formulated utterances that were regarded as final truths in a past generation are now seen to be insufficiencies. Every pronouncement that has opposed our own acceptances has been found to be a composition like any academic painting, something that is arbitrarily cut off from relations with environment, or framed off from interfering and disturbing data, or outlined with disregards. Our own attempt has been to take in the included, but also to take in the excluded into wider expressions. We accept, however, that for every one of our expressions there are irreconcilables somewhere that final utterance would include all things. However, of such is the gossip of angels. The final is unutterable in quasi-existence, where to think is to include but also to exclude, or be not final. If we admit that for every opinion we have expressed there must somewhere be an irreconcilable, we are intermediatists, and not positivists, not even higher positivists. Of course it may be that some day we shall systematize and dogmatize, and refuse to think of anything that we may be accused of disregarding, and believe instead of merely accepting. Then, if we could have a wider system which would acknowledge no irreconcilables, we'd be higher positivists. So long as we only accept, we are not higher positivists, but our feeling is that the new dominant, even though we have thought of it only as another enslavement, will be the nucleus for higher positivism, and that it will be the means of elevating into infinitude a new batch of fixed stars, until, as a recruiting instrument, it too will play out, and will give way to some new medium for generating absoluteness. It is our acceptance that all astronomers of today have lost their souls, or rather, all chance of attaining entity, but that Copernicus and Kepler, and Galileo and Newton, and conceivably Leverrier, are now fixed stars. Some day I shall attempt to identify them. In all this, I think we're quite a Moses. We point out the promised land, but, unless we be cured of our intermediatism, we will never be reported in monthly notices ourself. In our acceptance, dominants, in their succession, displace preceding dominants not only because they are more nearly positive, but because the old dominants, as recruiting mediums, play out. Our expression is that the new dominant, of wider inclusions, is now manifesting throughout the world, and that the old exclusionism is everywhere breaking down. In physics, exclusionism is breaking down by its own researches in radium, for instance, and in its speculations upon electrons, or its merging away into metaphysics, and by the desertion that has been going on for many years by such men as Gurney, Crookes, Wallace, Flammarion, Lodge, to formally disregard phenomena, no longer called spiritualism, but now psychic research. Biology is in chaos. Conventional Darwinites mixed up with mutationists and orthogenicists and followers of Weismann, who take from Darwinism one of its pseudo-bases and nevertheless try to reconcile their heresies with orthodoxy. The painters are metaphysicians and psychologists. The breaking down of exclusionism in China and Japan and in the United States has astonished history. The science of astronomy is going downward, so that, though Pickering, for instance, did speculate upon a trans-Neptunian planet, and Lowell did try to have accepted heretical ideas as to marks on Mars, attention is now minutely focused upon such technicalities as variations and shades of Jupiter's fourth satellite. I think that, in general acceptance, over-refinement indicates decadence. I think that the stronghold of inclusionism is in aeronautics. I think that the stronghold of the Old Dominant, when it was new, was in the invention of the telescope. Or that, coincidentally, with the breakdown of exclusionism appears the means of finding out whether there are vast aerial fields of ice and floating lakes full of frogs and fishes or not, where carved stones and black substances and great quantities of vegetable matter and flesh, which may be dragon's flesh, come from, whether there are interplanetary trade routes and vast areas devastated by super Tamerlanes, whether sometimes there are visitors to this earth, who might be pursued and captured and questioned. End of chapter 18. Recording by Acacia Wood. Chapter 19 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 19. I have industriously sought data for an expression upon birds, but the prospecting has not been very quasi-satisfactory. I think I rather emphasize our industriousness because a charge likely to be brought against the attitude of acceptance is that one who only accepts must be one of languid interest and little application of energy. It doesn't seem to work out. We are very industrious. I suggest to some of our disciples that they look into the matter of messages upon pigeons, of course attributed to earthly owners, but said to be undecipherable. I'd do it ourselves, only that would be selfish. That's more of the intermediatism that will keep us out of the firmament. Positivism is absolute egoism. But look back in the time of Andrée's polar expedition. Pigeons that would have no publicity ordinarily were often reported at that time. In the Zoologist 3/1821 is recorded an instance of a bird, puffin, that had fallen to the ground with a fractured head. Interesting, but mere speculation. But what solid object, high in the air, had that bird struck against? Tremendous red rain in France, October 16 and 17, 1846. Great storm at the time, and red rain supposed to have been colored by matter swept up from this earth's surface and then precipitated. Comptes Rendus 23, 832. But in Comptes Rendus 24, 625, the description of this red rain differs from one's impression of red, sandy, or muddy water. It is said that this rain was so vividly red and so blood-like that many persons in France were terrified. Two analyses are given, Comptes Rendus 24, 812. One chemist notes a great quantity of corpuscles, whether blood-like corpuscles or not, in the matter. The other chemist sets down organic matter at 35%. It may be that an interplanetary dragon had been slain somewhere, or that this red fluid, in which were many corpuscles, came from something not altogether pleasant to contemplate, about the size of the Catskill Mountains, perhaps. But the present datum is that with this substance, larks, quail, ducks, and water hens, some of them alive, fell at Lyons and Grenoble, and other places. I have notes upon other birds that have fallen from the sky, but unaccompanied by the red rain that makes the fall of birds in France peculiar, and very peculiar if it be accepted that the red substance was extra mundane. The other notes are upon birds that have fallen from the sky in the midst of storms, or of exhausted but living birds falling not far from a storm area. But now we shall have an instance for which I can find no parallel: fall of dead birds from a clear sky, far distant from any storm to which they could be attributed, so remote from any discoverable storm that my own notion is that, in the summer of 1896, something, or some beings, came as near to this earth as they could, upon a hunting expedition. That, in the summer of 1896, an expedition of super scientists passed over this earth and let down a dragnet, and what would it catch, sweeping through the air, supposing it to have reached not quite to this earth? In the Monthly Weather Review, May, 1917, W.L. McCaddy quotes from the Baton Rouge correspondence to the Philadelphia Times: that, in the summer of 1896, into the streets of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and from a clear sky, fell hundreds of dead birds. There were wild ducks and catbirds, woodpeckers, and many birds of strange plumage, some of them resembling canaries. Usually one does not have to look very far from any place to learn of a storm, but the best that could be done in this instance was to say there had been a storm on the coast of Florida. And unless he have psycho-chemic repulsion for the explanation, the reader feels only momentary astonishment that dead birds from a storm in Florida should fall from an unstormy sky in Louisiana, and with his intellect greased like the plumage of a wild duck, the datum then drops off. Our greasy, shiny brains: that they may be of some use after all, that other modes of existence place a high value upon them as lubricants, that we're hunted for them, a hunting expedition to this earth. The newspapers report a tornado. If from a clear sky, or a sky in which there were no driven clouds, or other evidences of still continuing wind power, or if from a storm in Florida, it could be accepted that hundreds of birds had fallen far away, in Louisiana, I conceive, conventionally, of heavier objects having fallen in Alabama, say, and of the fall of still heavier objects still nearer the origin in Florida. The sources of information of the Weather Bureau are widespread. It has no records of such falls. So a dragnet that was let down from above somewhere, or something that I learned from the more scientific of the investigators of psychic phenomena. The reader begins their works with prejudice against telepathy and everything else of psychic phenomenon. The writers deny spirit communication and say that the seeming data are data of only telepathy. Astonishing instances of seeming clairvoyance, only telepathy. After a while the reader finds himself agreeing that it's only telepathy, which at first had been intolerable to him. So maybe in 1896 a super dragnet did not sweep through this earth's atmosphere, gathering up all the birds within its field, the meshes then suddenly breaking. Or that the birds of Baton Rouge were only from the Super Sargasso Sea. Upon which we shall have another expression: we thought we'd settled that, and we thought we'd established that, but nothing's ever settled, and nothing's ever established, in a real sense, if, in a real sense, there is nothing in quasiness. I suppose there had been a storm somewhere, the storm in Florida perhaps, and many birds had been swept upward into the Super Sargasso Sea. It has frigid regions, and it has tropical regions. That birds of diverse species had been swept upward into an icy region, where, huddling together for warmth, they had died. Then later they had been dislodged, meteor coming along, boat, bicycle, dragon, don't know what did come along, something dislodged them. So leaves of trees, carried up there in whirlwinds, staying there years, ages, perhaps only a few months, but then falling to this earth at an unseasonable time for dead leaves. Fishes carried up there, some of them dying and drying, some of them living in volumes of water that are in abundance up there, or that fall sometimes in the deluges that we call cloudbursts. The astronomers won't think kindly of us, and we haven't done anything to endear ourselves to the meteorologists. But we're weak and mawkish intermediatists. Several times we've tried to get the aeronauts with us. Extraordinary things up there. Things that curators of museums would give up all hope of ever being fixed stars to obtain. Things left over from whirlwinds of the time of the pharaohs, perhaps. Or that Elijah did go up in the sky in something like a chariot, and may not be Vega after all, and that there may be a wheel or so left of whatever he went up in. We basely suggest that it would bring a high price, but sell soon, because after a while there'd be thousands of them hawked around. We weakly drop a hint to the aeronauts. In the Scientific American 33-197, there is an account of some hay that fell from the sky. From the circumstances, we incline to accept that this hay went up in a whirlwind, from this earth, in the first place, reached the Super Sargasso Sea, and remained there a long time before falling. An interesting point in this expression is the usual attribution to a local and coinciding whirlwind and identification of it, and then data that make that local whirlwind unacceptable. That, upon July 27, 1875, small masses of damp hay had fallen at Monkstown, Ireland. In the Dublin Daily Express, Dr. J.W. Moore had explained he had found a nearby whirlwind to the south of Monkstown that coincided. But according to the Scientific American, a similar fall had occurred near Wrexham, England, 2 days before. In November, 1918, I made some studies upon light objects thrown into the air. Armistice Day. I suppose I should have been more emotionally occupied, but I made notes upon torn-up papers thrown high in the air from windows of office buildings. Scraps of paper did stay together for a while, several minutes sometimes. Cosmos, 3-4-574. That, upon the 10th of April, 1869, at Autrich, Indre at Lohr, a great number of oak leaves, enormous segregation of them, fell from the sky. Very calm day. So little wind that the leaves fell almost vertically. Fall lasted about 10 minutes. Flammarion, in The Atmosphere, page 412, tells this story. He has to find a storm. He does find a squall. But it had occurred upon April 3rd. Flammarion's two incredibilities are that leaves could remain a week in the air, that they could stay together a week in the air. Think of some of your own observations upon papers thrown from an airplane. Our one incredibility: that these leaves had been whirled up 6 months before, when they were common on the ground, and had been sustained, of course not in the air, but in a region gravitationally inert, and had been precipitated by the disturbances of April rains. I have no records of leaves that have so fallen from the sky in October or November, the season when one might expect dead leaves to be raised from one place and precipitated somewhere else. I emphasize that this occurred in April. La Nature, 1889-94. That upon April 19, 1889, dried leaves of different species, oak, elm, etc., fell from the sky. This day, too, was a calm day. The fall was tremendous. The leaves were seen to fall 15 minutes, but, judging from the quantity on the ground, it is the writer's opinion that they had already been falling half an hour. I think that the geyser of corpses that sprang from Riobamba toward the sky must have been an interesting sight. If I were a painter, I'd like that subject. But this cataract of dried leaves, too, is a study in the rhythms of the dead. In this datum, the point most agreeable to us is the very point that the writer in La Nature emphasizes: windlessness. He says that the surface of the Loire was absolutely smooth. The river was strewn with leaves as far as he could see. L'Astronomie, 1894-194, that upon the 7th of April, 1894, dried leaves fell at Clairvaux and Outre-Aube, France. The fall is described as prodigious. Half an hour. Then, upon the 11th, a fall of dried leaves occurred at Pontcarré. It is in this recurrence that we found some of our opposition to the conventional explanation. The editor, Flammarion, explains. He says that the leaves had been caught up in a cyclone which had expended its force, that the heavier leaves had fallen first. We think that that was all right for 1894, and that it was quite good enough for 1894. But, in these more exacting days, we want to know how wind power insufficient to hold some leaves in the air could sustain others 4 days. The factors in this expression are unseasonableness, not for dried leaves, but for prodigious numbers of dried leaves, direct fall, windlessness, month of April, and localization in France. The factor of localization is interesting. Not a note have I upon fall of leaves from the sky, except these notes. Were the conventional explanation, or old correlate, acceptable, it would seem that similar occurrences in other regions should be as frequent as in France. The indication is that there may be quasi-permanent undulations in the Super Sargasso Sea, or a pronounced inclination toward France. Inspiration: that there may be a nearby world, complementary to this world, where autumn occurs at the time that is springtime here. Let some disciple have that. But there may be a dip toward France, so that leaves that are born high there are more likely to be held in suspension than high-flying leaves elsewhere. Some other time I shall take up super-geography and be guilty of charts. I think now that the Super Sargasso Sea is an oblique belt with changing ramifications over Great Britain, France, Italy, and on to India. Relatively to the United States, I am not very clear, but think especially of the southern states. The preponderance of our data indicates frigid regions aloft. Nevertheless, such phenomena as putrefaction have occurred often enough to make super-tropical regions also acceptable. We shall have one more datum upon the Super Sargasso Sea. It seems to me that, by this time, our requirements of support and reinforcement and agreement have been quite as rigorous for acceptance as ever for belief, at least for full acceptance. By virtue of mere acceptance we may, in some later book, deny the Super Sargasso Sea, and find that our data relate to some other complementary world instead, or the moon, and have abundant data for accepting that the moon is not more than 20 or 30 miles away. However, the Super Sargasso Sea functions very well as a nucleus around which to gather data that oppose exclusionism. That is our main motive, to oppose exclusionism, or our agreement with cosmic processes. The climax of our general expression upon the Super Sargasso Sea. Coincidentally appears something else that may overthrow it later. Notes and Queries, 8-12-228. That in the province of Macerata, Italy, summer of 1897, an immense number of small, blood-colored clouds covered the sky. About an hour later a storm broke, and myriad seeds fell to the ground. It is said that they were identified as products of a tree found only in Central Africa and the Antilles. If, in terms of conventional reasoning, these seeds had been high in the air, they had been in a cold region. But it is our acceptance that these seeds had, for a considerable time, been in a warm region, and for a time longer than is attributable to suspension by wind power. It is said that a great number of the seeds were in the first stage of germination. End of chapter 19. Recording by Acacia Wood. Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 20. The New Dominant. Inclusionism. In it we have a pseudo-standard. We have a datum, and we give it an interpretation in accordance with our pseudo-standard. At present we have not the delusions of absolutism that may have translated some of the positivists of the 19th century to heaven. We are intermediatists, but feel a lurking suspicion that we may some day solidify and dogmatize and illiberalize into higher positivists. At present we do not ask whether something be reasonable or preposterous, because we recognize that by reasonableness and preposterousness are meant agreement and disagreement with a standard, which must be a delusion, though not absolutely, of course, and must some day be displaced by a more advanced quasi-delusion. Scientists in the past have taken the positivist attitude: is this or that reasonable or unreasonable? Analyze them, and we find that they meant relatively to a standard, such as Newtonism, Daltonism, Darwinism, or Lyellism. But they have written and spoken and thought as if they could mean real reasonableness and real unreasonableness. So our pseudo-standard is inclusionism, and if a datum be a correlate to a more widely inclusive outlook as to this earth and its externality and relations with externality, its harmony with inclusionism admits it. Such was the process, and such was the requirement for admission in the days of the Old Dominant. Our difference is an underlying intermediatism, or consciousness that though we're more nearly real, we and our standards are only quasi. Or that all things in our intermediate state are phantoms in a supermind in a dreaming state, but striving to awaken to realness. Though in some respects our own intermediatism is unsatisfactory, our underlying feeling is that in a dreaming mind awakening is accelerated. If phantoms in that mind know that they're only phantoms in a dream, of course they too are quasi, but in a relative sense they have an essence of what is called realness. They are derived from experience or from sense relations, even though grotesque distortions. It seems acceptable that a table that is seen when one is awake is more nearly real than a dreamed table which, with 15 or 20 legs, chases one. So now, in the 20th century, with a change of terms and a change in underlying consciousness, our attitude toward the new dominant is the attitude of the scientists of the 19th century to the old dominant. We do not insist that our data and interpretations shall be shocking, grotesque, evil, ridiculous, childish, insincere, laughable, ignorant, to 19th centuryites, as were their data and interpretations to the medieval-minded. We ask only whether data and interpretations correlate. If they do, they are acceptable, perhaps only for a short time, or as nuclei, or scaffolding, or preliminary sketches, or as gropings and tentativenesses. Later, of course, when we cool off and harden and radiate into space most of our present mobility, which expresses in modesty and plasticity, we shall acknowledge no scaffoldings, gropings, or tentativenesses, but think we utter absolute facts. A point in intermediatism here is opposed to most current speculations upon development. Usually one thinks of the spiritual as higher than the material, but in our acceptance, quasi-existence is a means by which the absolutely immaterial materializes absolutely, and, being intermediate, is a state in which nothing is finally either immaterial or material. All objects, substances, thoughts, occupying some grade of approximation one way or the other. Final solidification of the ethereal is, to us, the goal of cosmic ambition. Positivism is Puritanism. Heat is evil. Final good is absolute frigidity. An Arctic winter is very beautiful, but I think that an interest in monkeys chattering in palm trees accounts for our own intermediatism. Visitors. Our confusion here, out of which we are attempting to make quasi-order, is as great as it has been throughout this book, because we have not the positivist's delusion of homogeneity. A positivist would gather all data that seem to relate to one kind of visitors and coldly disregard all other data. I think of as many different kinds of visitors to this earth as there are visitors to New York, to a jail, to a church. Some persons go to church to pickpockets, for instance. My own acceptance is that either a world or a vast superconstruction, or a world, if red substances and fishes fell from it, hovered over India in the summer of 1860. Something then fell from somewhere July 17, 1860, at Dharamsala. Whatever it was, it is so persistently alluded to as a meteorite that I look back and see that I adopted this convention myself. But in the London Times, December 26, 1860, Syed Abdullah, professor of Hindustani, University College London, writes that he had sent to a friend in Dharamsala for an account of the stones that had fallen at that place. The answer: diverse forms and sizes, many of which bore great resemblance to ordinary cannon balls just discharged from engines of war. It's an addition to our data of spherical objects that have arrived upon this earth. Note that they are spherical stone objects. And in the evening of the same day that something took a shot at Dharamsala, or sent objects upon which there may be decipherable markings, lights were seen in the air. I think myself of a number of things, beings, whatever they were, trying to get down, but resisted, like balloonists at a certain altitude trying to get farther up, but resisted. Not in the least, except to good positivists, or the homogeneous minded, does this speculation interfere with the concept of some other world that is in successful communication with certain esoteric ones upon this earth, by a code of symbols that print in rock, like symbols of telephotographers in selenium. I think that sometimes, in favorable circumstances, emissaries have come to this earth. Secret meetings. Of course it sounds... but secret meetings, emissaries, esoteric ones in Europe before the war broke out, and those who suggested that such phenomena could be. However, as to most of our data, I think of super things that have passed close to this earth with no more interest in this earth than have passengers upon a steamship in the bottom of the sea, or passengers may have a keen interest, but circumstances of schedules and commercial requirements forbid investigation of the bottom of the sea. Then, on the other hand, we may have data of super scientific attempts to investigate phenomena of this earth from above, perhaps by beings from so far away that they had never even heard that something, somewhere, asserts a legal right to this earth. Altogether, we're good intermediatists, but we can't be very good hypnotists. Still another source of the merging away of our data: that, upon general principles of continuity, if super vessels, or super vehicles, have traversed this earth's atmosphere, there must be mergers between them and terrestrial phenomena. Observations upon them must merge away into observations upon clouds, and balloons, and meteors. We shall begin with data that we cannot distinguish ourselves, and work our way out of mergers into extremes. In the observatory 35-168, it is said that, according to a newspaper, March 6, 1912, residents of Warmley, England, were greatly excited by something that was supposed to be a splendidly illuminated aeroplane passing over the village. The machine was apparently traveling at a tremendous rate, and came from the direction of Bath, and went on towards Gloucester. The editor says that it was a large, triple-headed fireball. Tremendous indeed, he says, but we are prepared for anything nowadays. That is satisfactory. We'd not like to creep up stealthily and then jump out of a corner with our data. This editor, at least, is prepared to read. Nature, October 27, 1898. A correspondent writes that, in the county Wicklow, Ireland, at about 6 o'clock in the evening, he had seen, in the sky, an object that looked like the moon in its three-quarter aspect. We note the shape, which approximates to triangularity, and we note that in color it is said to have been golden yellow. It moved slowly, and in about 5 minutes disappeared behind a mountain. The editor gives his opinion that the object may have been an escaped balloon. In Nature, August 11, 1898, there is a story, taken from the July number of the Canadian Weather Review, by the meteorologist F.F. Payne, that he had seen, in the Canadian sky, a large, pear-shaped object sailing rapidly. At first he supposed that the object was a balloon, its outline being sharply defined. But, as no cage was seen, it was concluded that it must be a mass of cloud. In about 6 minutes this object became less definite, whether because of increasing distance or not. The mass became less dense, and finally it disappeared. As to cyclonic formation, no whirling motion could be seen. Nature, 58-294. That, upon July 8, 1898, a correspondent had seen, at Kiel, an object in the sky, colored red by the sun, which had set. It was about as broad as a rainbow and about 12 degrees high. It remained in its original brightness about 5 minutes, and then faded rapidly, and then remained almost stationary again, finally disappearing about 8 minutes after I first saw it. In an intermediate existence, we quasi-persons have nothing to judge by, because everything is its own opposite. If $100 a week be a standard of luxurious living to some persons, it is poverty to others. We have instances of 3 objects that were seen in the sky in a space of 3 months, and this concurrence seems to me to be something to judge by. Science has been built upon concurrence: so have been most of the fallacies and fanaticisms. I feel the positivism of a Leverrier, or instinctively take to the notion that all 3 of these observations relate to the same object. However, I don't formulate them and predict the next transit. Here's another chance for me to become a fixed star, but as usual, oh well. A point in intermediatism: that the intermediatist is likely to be a flaccid compromiser. Our own attitude: ours is a partly positive and partly negative state, or a state in which nothing is finally positive or finally negative. But if positivism attract you, go ahead and try. You will be in harmony with cosmic endeavor. But continuity will resist you. Only to have appearance in quasiness is to be proportionately positive, but beyond a degree of attempted positivism, continuity will rise to pull you back. Success, as it is called, though there is only success failure in intermediateness, will, in intermediateness, be yours proportionately as you are in adjustment with its own state, or some positivism mixed with compromise and retreat. To be very positive is to be a Napoleon Bonaparte, against whom the rest of civilization will sooner or later combine. For interesting data, see newspaper accounts of fate of one Dowie, of Chicago. Intermediatism, then, is recognition that our state is only a quasi-state. It is no bar to one who desires to be positive. It is recognition that he cannot be positive and remain in a state that is positive negative, or that a great positivist, isolated, with no system to support him, will be crucified, or will starve to death, or will be put in jail and beaten to death: that these are the birth pangs of translation to the positive absolute. So, though positive negative myself, I feel the attraction of the positive pole of our intermediate state, and attempt to correlate these 3 data, to see them homogeneously, to think that they relate to one object. In the aeronautic journals and in the London Times there is no mention of escaped balloons, in the summer or fall of 1898. In the New York Times there is no mention of ballooning in Canada or the United States in the summer of 1898. London Times, September 29, 1885. A clipping from the Royal Gazette of Bermuda of September 8, 1885, sent to the Times by General Lefroy. That upon August 27, 1885, at about 8:30 A.M., there was observed by Mrs. Adelina D. Bassett a strange object in the clouds coming from the north. She called the attention of Mrs. L. Lowell to it, and they were both somewhat alarmed. However, they continued to watch the object steadily for some time. It drew nearer. It was of triangular shape, and seemed to be about the size of a pilot boat mainsail, with chains attached to the bottom of it. While crossing the land it had appeared to descend, but, as it went out to sea, it ascended, and continued to ascend, until it was lost to sight high in the clouds. Or with such power to ascend, I don't think much myself of the notion that it was an escaped balloon, partly deflated. Nevertheless, General Lefroy, correlating with exclusionism, attempts to give a terrestrial interpretation to this occurrence. He argues that the thing may have been a balloon that had escaped from France or England, or the only aerial thing of terrestrial origin that, even to this date of about 35 years later, has been thought to have crossed the Atlantic Ocean. He accounts for the triangular form by deflation: a shapeless bag, barely able to float. My own acceptance is that great deflation does not accord with observations upon its power to ascend. In the Times, October 1st, 1885, Charles Harding, of the RMS, argues that if it had been a balloon from Europe, surely it would have been seen and reported by many vessels. Whether he was as good a Briton as the general or not, he shows awareness of the United States, or that the thing may have been a partly collapsed balloon that had escaped from the United States. General Lefroy wrote to Nature about it, Nature 3399, saying, whatever his sensitivenesses may have been, that the columns of the Times were hardly suitable for such a discussion. If, in the past, there had been more persons like General Lefroy, we'd have better than the mere fragments of data that in most cases are too broken up very well to piece together. He took the trouble to write to a friend of his, W.H. Gosling, of Bermuda, who also was an extraordinary person. He went to the trouble of interviewing Mrs. Bassett and Mrs. Lowell. Their description to him was somewhat different: an object from which nets were suspended. Deflated balloon with its network hanging from it. A super dragnet? That something was trawling overhead? The birds of Baton Rouge. Mr. Gosling wrote that the item of chains, or suggestion of a basket that had been attached, had originated with Mr. Bassett, who had not seen the object. Mr. Gosling mentioned a balloon that had escaped from Paris in July. He tells of a balloon that fell in Chicago September 17th, or 3 weeks later than the Bermuda object. It's one incredibility against another, with disregards and convictions governed by whichever of the two dominants looms stronger in each reader's mind. That he can't think for himself any more than I can is understood. My own correlates. I think that we're fished for. It may be that we're highly esteemed by super epicures somewhere. It makes me more cheerful when I think that we may be of some use after all. I think that dragnets have often come down and have been mistaken for whirlwinds and waterspouts. Some accounts of seeming structure in whirlwinds and waterspouts are astonishing. And I have data that, in this book, I can't take up at all: mysterious disappearances. I think we're fished for. But this is a little expression on the side, relates to trespassers, has nothing to do with the subject that I shall take up at some other time, or our use to some other mode of seeming that has a legal right to us. Nature 33-137. Our Paris correspondent writes that in relation to the balloon which is said to have been seen over Bermuda in September, no ascent took place in France which can account for it. Last of August, not September. In the London Times there is no mention of balloon ascents in Great Britain in the summer of 1885, but mention of 2 ascents in France. Both balloons had escaped. In L'Aéronaute, August 1885, it is said that these balloons had been sent up from fêtes of the 14th of July, 44 days before the observation at Bermuda. The aeronauts were Gower and Alloy. Gower's balloon was found floating on the ocean, but Alloy's balloon was not found. Upon the 17th of July it was reported by a sea captain, still in the air, still inflated. But this balloon of Alloy's was a small exhibition balloon, made for short ascents from fêtes and fairgrounds. In La Nature, 1885 2-131, it is said that it was a very small balloon, incapable of remaining long in the air. As to contemporaneous ballooning in the United States, I find only one account: an ascent in Connecticut, July 29, 1885. Upon leaving this balloon, the aeronauts had pulled the ripcord, turning it inside out. New York Times, August 10, 1885. To the intermediatist, the accusation of anthropomorphism is meaningless. There is nothing in anything that is unique or positively different. We'd be materialists were it not quite as rational to express the material in terms of the immaterial as to express the immaterial in terms of the material. Oneness of allness in quasiness. I will engage to write the formula of any novel in psychochemic terms, or draw its graph in psychomechanic terms, or write, in romantic terms, the circumstances and sequences of any chemic or electric or magnetic reaction, or express any historic event in algebraic terms, or see Boole and Jevons for economic situations, expressed algebraically. I think of the dominants as I think of persons, not meaning that they are real persons, not meaning that we are real persons. Or the old dominant and its jealousy, and its suppression of all things and thoughts that endangered its supremacy. In reading discussions of papers by scientific societies, I have often noted how, when they approached forbidden or irreconcilable subjects, the discussions were thrown into confusion and ramification. It's as if scientific discussions have often been led astray, as if purposefully, as if by something directive hovering over them. Of course, I mean only the spirit of all development. Just so, in any embryo, cells that would tend to vary from the appearances of their era are compelled to correlate. In Nature, 90-169, Charles Tilden Smith writes that, at Chisbury, Wiltshire, England, April 8, 1912, he saw something in the sky, unlike anything that I had ever seen before. Although I have studied the skies for many years, I have never seen anything like it. He saw two stationary dark patches upon clouds. The extraordinary part, they were stationary upon clouds that were rapidly moving. They were fan-shaped, or triangular, and varied in size, but kept the same position upon different clouds as cloud after cloud came along. For more than half an hour Mr. Smith watched these dark patches. His impression as to the one that appeared first, that it was really a heavy shadow cast upon a thin veil of clouds by some unseen object away in the west, which was intercepting the sun's rays. Upon page 244 of this volume of Nature is a letter from another correspondent to the effect that similar shadows are cast by mountains upon clouds, and that no doubt Mr. Smith was right in attributing the appearance to some unseen object which was intercepting the sun's rays. But the Old Dominant that was a jealous dominant, and the wrath of the Old Dominant against such an irreconcilability as large opaque objects in the sky casting down shadows upon clouds. Still the dominants are suave very often, or are not absolute gods, and the way attention was led away from this subject is an interesting study in quasi-divine bamboozlement. Upon page 268 Charles J.P. Cave, the meteorologist, writes that, upon April 5 and 8 at Ditcham Park, Petersfield, he had observed a similar appearance, while watching some pilot balloons, but he describes something not in the least like a shadow on clouds, but a stationary cloud. The inference seems to be that the shadows at Chisbury may have been shadows of pilot balloons. Upon page 322 another correspondent writes upon shadows cast by mountains. Upon page 348 someone else carries on the divergence by discussing this third letter, then someone takes up the third letter mathematically, and then there is a correction of error in this mathematic demonstration. I think it looks very much like what I think it looks like. But the mystery here, that the dark patches at Chisbury could not have been cast by stationary pilot balloons that were to the west, or that were between clouds and the setting sun. If, to the west of Chisbury, a stationary object were high in the air, intercepting the sun's rays, the shadow of the stationary object would not have been stationary, but would have moved higher and higher with the setting of the sun. I have to think of something that is in accord with no other data whatsoever. A luminous body, not the sun, in the sky, but, because of some unknown principle or atmospheric condition, its light extended down only about to the clouds, that from it were suspended two triangular objects, like the object that was seen in Bermuda, that it was this light that fell short of the earth that these objects intercepted, that the objects were drawn up and lowered from something overhead so that, in its light, their shadows changed size. If my grope seems to have no grasp in it, and if a stationary balloon will, in half an hour, not cast a stationary shadow from the setting sun, we have to think of two triangular objects that accurately maintain positions in a line between sun and clouds, and at the same time approach and receded from clouds. Whatever it may have been, it's enough to make the devout make the sign of the crucible, or whatever the devotees of the Old Dominant do in the presence of a new correlate. Vast, black thing poised like a crow over the moon. It is our acceptance that these two shadows of Chisbury looked, from the moon, like vast things, black as crows, poised over the earth. It is our acceptance that two triangular luminosities, and then two triangular patches, like vast black things, poised like crows over the moon, and, like the triangularities at Chisbury, have been seen upon or over the moon. Scientific American, 4649. Two triangular luminous appearances reported by several observers in Lebanon, Connecticut, evening of July 3, 1882, on the moon's upper limb. They disappeared, and two dark triangular appearances that looked like notches were seen 3 minutes later upon the lower limb. They approached each other, met, and instantly disappeared. The merger here is notches that have at times been seen upon the moon's limb, thought to be cross-sections of craters. Monthly Notices, RAS 37432. But these appearances of July 3, 1882, were vast upon the moon, seemed to be cutting off or obliterating nearly a quarter of its surface. Something else that may have looked like a vast black crow poised over this earth from the moon. Monthly Weather Review 41/599. Description of a shadow in the sky of some unseen body, April 8, 1913, Fort Worth, Texas, supposed to have been cast by an unseen cloud. This patch of shade moved with the declining sun. Report of the British Association, 1854, 410. Account by two observers of a faint but distinctly triangular object visible for 6 nights in the sky. It was observed from two stations that were not far apart. But the parallax was considerable. Whatever it was acceptably, relatively close to this earth. I should say that relatively to phenomena of light we are in confusion as great as some of the discords that orthodoxy is in relatively to light. Broadly and intermediatistically, our position is that light is not really and necessarily light, any more than is anything else really and necessarily anything, but an interpretation of a mode of force, as I suppose we have to call it, as light. At sea level, the Earth's atmosphere interprets sunlight as red or orange or yellow. High up on mountains the sun is blue. Very high up on mountains the zenith is black. Or it is orthodoxy to say that in interplanetary space, where there is no air, there is no light. So then the sun and comets are black, but this Earth's atmosphere, or rather dust particles in it, interpret radiations from these black objects as light. We look up at the moon. The jet black moon is so silvery white. I have about 50 notes indicating that the moon has atmosphere. Nevertheless, most astronomers hold out that the moon has no atmosphere. They have to. The theory of eclipses would not work out otherwise. So, arguing in conventional terms, the moon is black. Rather astonishing, explorers upon the moon, stumbling and groping in intense darkness, with telescopes powerful enough, we could see them stumbling and groping in brilliant light. Or, just because of familiarity, it is not now obvious to us how the preposterousness of the old system must have seemed to the correlates of the system preceding it. Ye jet black silvery moon. Altogether, then, it may be conceivable that there are phenomena of force that are interpretable as light as far down as the clouds, but not in denser strata of air, or just the opposite of familiar interpretations. I now have some notes upon an occurrence that suggests a force not interpreted by air as light, but interpreted or reflected by the ground as light. I think of something that, for a week, was suspended over London, of an emanation that was not interpreted as light until it reached the ground. Lancet, June 1, 1867. That every night for a week, a light had appeared in Woburn Square, London, upon the grass of a small park enclosed by railings. Crowds gathering, police called out for the special service of maintaining order and making the populace move on. The editor of the Lancet went to the square. He says that he saw nothing but a patch of light falling upon an arbor at the northeast corner of the enclosure. Seems to me that that was interesting enough. In this editor we have a companion for Mr. Symons and Dr. Gray. He suggests that the light came from a street lamp. Does not say that he could trace it to any such origin himself, but recommends that the police investigate neighboring street lamps. I'd not say that such a commonplace as light from a street lamp would not attract and excite and deceive great crowds for a week, but I do accept that any cop who was called upon for extra work would have needed nobody's suggestion to settle that point the very first thing. Or that something in the sky hung suspended over a London square for a week. End of Chapter 20. Recording by Acacia Wood.